Fred, thank you for joining me here today. As you know, the past week in the United States has been racked with violence. We've seen this in protest across the country, in fact, across the world. And it seemed to begin with the death of George Floyd while in police custody. Tragically, we know that this is not a rare occurrence, an African-American man being attacked or killed while in police custody. But what has made this moment different?
We are indeed living through a tragic time in American history. What I believe is different is three things. First, we witnessed the modern equivalent of a lynching, and we need to see the events of the week in the context of the systemic racial injustice that defines the history of the United States, both in terms of how we treated the people who were here before the Europeans arrived, and how we treated people who are descended from folks we brought here from elsewhere. Second, it's important to keep in mind that all of this happened in the first week of opening up and allowing people to leave their homes after 2 to 3 months locked in place. And people were looking for an outlet, and demagogues were able to channel their desire for an outlet into something destructive rather than constructive. And then finally, the president, from the time he began contemplating running for office through to the present day, uses language that predictably creates the conditions that lead to violence. But the pattern changed this week, and that is, instead of saying things that lead people to commit violence, he actually used the vocabulary of violence. When the looting starts, the shooting starts. He retweeted, "The only good Democrat is a dead Democrat." He called for the use of dogs against protesters. That's Bull Connor stuff from the civil rights movement. He used the deployment of the active duty military and said there would be a strong response when the military is statutorily not permitted to engage in domestic law enforcement. These three things combined led to something that benefits the president. And that is, for the first time in months, we're not talking about the death count from COVID-19 and the bungled administration response to the virus.
You noted that one of the aspects that makes this moment unique is that through that video, we watched the modern day equivalent of a lynching. And now when you look at the protests that are happening, the images that are coming out of that, the tactics the police are using, harken back to what we saw in the civil rights movement. Talk to me more about this moment and this pattern that we have seen time and again within the United States.
Let me begin by acknowledging that I carry with me all of the manifestations of white privilege. And I want to name that and just hold that out there. But I come to this from a deep place of empathy. I'm an immigrant to the United States. I'm an American by choice. I'm proud to be a citizen, and I wouldn't dream of living anywhere else. Having said that, the stated aspiration of the United States as embodied in the Declaration, that all people are created equal, has not translated to all people being treated equally. And the original sin of American history is slavery. But it was preceded by the treatment of those who were here before the Europeans colonized this continent. Those two trends have stayed with us for the entire history of the nation, certainly for the past 240 something years since the Declaration was passed. We fought a civil war to end slavery. We bungled Reconstruction that led to 100 years of legal apartheid, of institutionalized government-sponsored racism, where there were two classes of citizens, and some had equal privileges to everyone else, and some were intentionally held in second-class status. The civil rights movement was an attempt to try to remedy that. It is still a work in progress. Lynching was a public execution intended to send a signal. And not only did people gather in the town square to watch, but the body or bodies hang from trees for days and days as a warning to the at-risk community. Today, the public square is on smartphones. And Michael Brown's body was left on the street for hours before the police came and covered it. We saw the police officers this week in the George Floyd killing, kneeling on his body for nearly 9 minutes. Multiple police kneeling on his body, one on his air pipe. And they continued to kneel for minutes after he stopped breathing and was lifeless. We witnessed a lynching, and that's different from witnessing other acts of violence.
You noted before that you benefit from white privilege, as do I. What role do those with privilege have in continuing this conversation, continuing the movement forward for actual racial justice and equality in the United States?
Well, let me begin my response by again acknowledging my own privilege, and it's not my place to tell anyone how they should think about themselves and think about racial injustice in this country. Having said that, silence is complicity with the injustice that is taking place. As Dr. King said, evil exists when good people say nothing in the presence of injustice. So good people need to raise their voices and say, I'm here with you. I'm here for you. This isn't directly affecting me. I can be pulled over by a police officer and not have any concern about what's going to happen to me after the traffic stop. That's a manifestation of privilege. But those who have that privilege can exercise it. To whom much is given, much is expected. And part of being an engaged citizen is to recognize the anomalies that misalign with our civic values. We need to reignite our civic values as a way of countering the incendiary behavior and the incendiary vocabulary that we see so often manifest these days.
Fred, one of the other patterns that you noted was that the rhetoric that President Trump has been using has not brought people together as other presidents have done in moments of tragedy, but has actually served to divide us further. Why is he doing this?
I won't attribute motive because I can't get inside his mind or his soul. But I can tell you that in my book, Words on Fire, I document 12 forms of language that have historically preceded acts of mass violence. And I document further that private citizen Trump, candidate Trump, and President Trump uses all 12 forms of language that have historically preceded and been associated with violence. Now, those forms of language have two effects. The first is it creates the conditions where violence against a suspect group or rival or critic is seen to be socially acceptable. The second is it lessens the capacity for empathy among members of the society at large. And when he uses these forms of language, we see private citizens on their own initiative begin to commit insult, exclusion, violence, up to and including acts of mass terrorism. And that's a predictable phenomenon. Words on Fire is intended to show the pattern, name how to call attention to it, and name how to hold leaders accountable when they do that kind of thing.
But Fred, it seems as though something has changed in President Trump's rhetoric within the past week. There seems to have been an escalation from these implicit calls for violence that you document in Words on Fire to actual explicit calls for violence. Looting is permission for shooting or something along those lines. Is this consistent with the pattern, or has there in fact been an escalation?
I document a number of patterns of Trump's language. And one of those patterns is, as he began to get away with using the 12 forms of language that lead to violence, he escalated both the content and the intensity. So it began with, if Obama was born in Kenya, then he can't be president. But then it moved to Nancy Pelosi explicitly supports human trafficking and drugs being smuggled into the country. Now that's an escalation. And then a further escalation when the looting starts, the shooting starts. He had used explicit calls to violence, but in a very low-key way. At a rally, why doesn't somebody punch that guy in the mouth? if you're arrested for punching someone, I'll pay for your legal fees. But never the explicit retweeting, as he did last week, of one of his supporters who happens to be a government official, saying the only good Democrat is a dead Democrat. That's the kind of thing that gives some people permission to go out and kill people. When he says, when the looting starts, the shooting starts, that gives some people the assumption that he has given them permission to go out and shoot at people they perceive to be looters. When he says not only reporters write fake news, but escalates it to enemies of the people, to anyone who writes negatively about me is committing treason, that leads to some police explicitly committing violence against journalists. The escalation is part of the pattern.
And how is Trump served by this pattern? How is this actually helping him?
One of the things to note is it keeps people off balance, it plays to his base, and it distracts from the actual news of the day. So note that it was all COVID-19 all the time, including we're at 100,000 fatalities and where's the president? And all of a sudden, we're not talking about COVID-19 anymore. Except incidentally, why aren't the protesters wearing masks? But we're not focusing on the daily death toll from COVID-19. We're talking about the daily death toll on the streets of American cities. So we have shifted the focus from the public health crisis to the civil unrest on the streets crisis. And now it's all Minneapolis, Phoenix, Washington, New York, San Francisco, Oakland. Now the news is documenting simultaneous dozens and dozens of protests and acts of violence. By the way, the protests and the acts of violence are not necessarily the same thing, but they are being conflated in the public imagination. And the president benefits from that because he keeps people off balance and not looking at things that are actually really, really serious as well.
One of the things that you note in Words on Fire is that leaders have a responsibility to call out this rhetoric when they see it. And one of the things we've seen in the past several days, whether that was through the Illinois governor, on a phone call with President Trump saying this rhetoric is causing more problems than it's solving, to Nancy Pelosi or Joe Biden today talking about how his rhetoric is fanning the flames. How can leaders combat or stand up to this rhetoric to either end it or to minimize the chance that this rhetoric can lead to violence?
What Governor Pritzker said was exactly the right start, but it wasn't sufficient. Saying, hey, this rhetoric doesn't help is different from, hey, Mr. President, what you're saying is going to cause lives. And we need to name the foreseeable consequence. We can't use euphemism. So one of the things I document in the book is 3 leaders who went over the line. They didn't intend to necessarily, but they went over the line and their language put people's lives at risk. And what caused them to go back? What caused them to go back was people in positions of authority whom they trusted, and private citizens as well, naming the foreseeable consequence of that language. So, for example, I have the highest respect for Senator John McCain. But during his 2008 campaign, he and his running mate, Governor Palin, were using language, including that the president pals around with the senator pals around with terrorists. And the birther conspiracy, which they didn't use, was in the mix. So people began to conflate terrorism with the birther conspiracy. And at rallies, at Senator McCain rallies, people began to call for Senator Obama to be assassinated. The Secret Service had to go and investigate. John Lewis, civil rights hero, congressman, and one of Senator McCain's closest friends, called Senator McCain on it and said, Senator, you're playing with fire. People are going to be killed. You sound more like George Wallace than you do like a future president, and you need to stop it. Another of Senator McCain's supporters, who is a close friend of the senator, whose book Senator McCain had blurbed, published an open letter and said, Senator, unless you stop the demonization of Senator Obama right now, and let the world know that he is worthy of running for Senate. I will hold you personally accountable for any attempts on the senator's life or on his family's life. We need that kind of clarity, not this isn't helpful, not the journalist asking, aren't you worried that your language might cause violence? Because when they ask him that question, he says no. So we need to name the pattern, we need to name the consequence, and we need to name that we're going to hold him accountable for the consequences of his language.
So that's the responsibility of civic leaders to call out this rhetoric when they see it.
And engaged citizens.
That was my question. So what is our role as engaged citizens? How can we help call out leaders in a way that is actually going to affect change?
Civic leaders include more than people in government. It includes people in public life, people in positions of authority, journalists, professors, and engaged citizens who can make their voices heard. Black Lives Matter is an attempt to remedy a particular injustice. It's a noble cause, and it ought to be supported. Separate from that, we need another movement. And that movement is leaders must stop using the kinds of language that have the predictable consequence of provoking violence. In Words on Fire, I call language that provokes people to commit violence lone wolf whistles, because it mobilizes individuals to take matters into their own hands. And the metaphor of lone wolf is not of my naming. It is in the vernacular of national security, intelligence, and law enforcement. And a lone wolf is someone who commits violence, self-motivated, self-directed, self-equipped, chooses his or her own targets, usually his own targets. The lone wolf whistle, I document in the book, has the effect of taking latent people who carry a grievance and converting them into active committers of violence against those with whom they have a grievance. And sometimes the grievance is against a group, white supremacists. Sometimes the grievance is against an individual. President supporter wants to neutralize the critics. Sometimes the violence is against a category, journalists, but whether it's against a group of people because of their identity or because of their profession or because they're critics of the president, it is predictable. So we need to call attention to lone wolf whistles when we hear them. We need to name the violence committed in the aftermath of lone wolf whistles, and we need to hold the leaders who use the lone wolf whistles accountable for it.